Welcome and thank you for joining us this evening for the third of a four-part video series on dyslexia. The four-part Georgia Department of Education's Dyslexia Video Series was developed through a partnership between the Georgia Department of Education and the Mary Frances Early College of Education at the University of Georgia. Tonight's topic is Dyslexia and Individuals with Disabilities Act. This video explores the relationship between dyslexia and services offered under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. I'm going to ask you to please place any questions you have in the chat at any time to be answered later this evening by Dr. Sayeski and Dr. Lindstrom during our Q&A portion. The question moderator, Nicole Vella, who is president of the Reading League Georgia, is going to be monitoring questions this evening. Before we begin, I want to introduce our speakers, Dr. Kristen Sayeski and Dr. Jennifer Lindstrom. Dr. Sayeski is an associate professor in the Department of Communication Sciences and Special Education and co-director of the Dyslexia Certificate and Endorsement Programs at the University of Georgia. Dr. Sayeski received her doctorate in special education from the University of Virginia in 2000. Her professional and research interests include identifying exemplary practices related to teacher development and determining effective instructional practices for students with learning disabilities, particularly in reading instruction and intervention. Dr. Jennifer Lindstrom joined the teaching and learning team at the Georgia Department of Education in September 2021 as the statewide dyslexia coordinator to assist our state as we lift awareness of dyslexia and create stronger evidence-based supports for students who are experiencing difficulties while learning to read and write. Dr. Lindstrom's leadership and guidance will ensure that our students get the best of the best from our teachers and schools. Dr. Lindstrom continues to serve as an associate professor in the Department of Communication Sciences and Special Education and as adjunct professor in the Department of Educational Psychology at the University of Georgia. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Sayeski and Lindstrom.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you for logging on and joining us for this third webinar in a four-part series. We appreciate your commitment to supporting students with dyslexia. And as Kim, thank you for the wonderful introduction. As Kim said, tonight we will be focusing on the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act and how that relates to dyslexia, or students with dyslexia. So we'll begin with Dr. Sayeski providing an overview and kind of unraveling that third video. And then at the end, I will be providing additional information really specific to state level questions that we receive often on this topic. At the state level, I should say, from parents and teachers and administrators. So thank you for those of you who submitted questions in advance. We have looked at those, and I think we're going to be addressing a lot of those throughout the presentation, but of course we invite additional questions during the presentation as well. So I will turn it over to Dr. Sayeski. Thank you.
Thanks. Welcome back. I'm delighted to be sharing this video tonight with you. This is actually one of my favorite videos in the series because it tackles and addresses a lot of commonly misunderstood concepts, particularly in relationship to the eligibility of students with dyslexia to receive special education services under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act within schools. And so, as Dr. Lindstrom said, we're going to start off and we're going to get to the video. I'm going to do a little less unraveling in between video segments than I have done in the prior webinars because a lot of our time tonight, or a good chunk of our time at the end, is really going to be spent in talking about these questions that directly relate and are pertinent to services students receive and processes within the state of Georgia. So with that, let's go ahead and look at the first segment.
Welcome to the third video in our dyslexia series, Dyslexia and the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. This video series was developed through a partnership between the Georgia Department of Education and the Mary Frances Early College of Education at the University of Georgia. In this video, we will explore the relationship between dyslexia and services offered under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. The video will be organized around common questions that arise when discussing dyslexia and the law. Let's get started. Question 1. What are federal education laws and why do schools have to follow them? To understand a school's obligation to provide services to students with dyslexia, we start by explaining why schools have federal obligations in the first place. In 1965, Lyndon B. Johnson passed the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which would result in the delivery of federal dollars to public schools across the nation. ESEA, as the law is commonly referred to, was part of President Johnson's War on Poverty, as the goal of the law was to provide a monetary boost to schools, particularly schools in high poverty areas. With these federal dollars came federal regulations. 10 years after the passage of ESEA, the first special education law was passed, the Education for All Handicapped Children Act of 1975. EHA would establish formal protections for students with disabilities. The protections ranged from basic, all kids with disabilities have a right to go to school, to nuanced, students served under the law are entitled to a free, appropriate public education. EHA was later renamed the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act and is now simply referred to as the IDEA.
All right. So one question that typically comes up when people are asking about the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act is really a misunderstanding about why schools have certain rules they have to follow, and and how the federal government is playing a role within these rules and these obligations. And so what a lot of people don't realize is that education is a state's right, which means that states determine the curricula, they set their protocols, they set their policies. And historically, the federal government hasn't played a particularly large role in that. In 1965, with the passage of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, that was the first time that the federal government really played a very large role within educations. And they did that. It was part of, Lyndon B. Johnson's War on Poverty was kind of to lift up schools by infusing some federal dollars into these schools to provide funds to schools that really needed them. And then as a result of receiving those funds, schools then had obligations. So we're going to give you this money. And now we're going to say, if you take this money, then we need to make sure that, kids are learning and things are happening and your teachers are have licensed and they have different protocols associated with that under the law. So 10 years after the Elementary and Secondary Education Act was passed, then the IDEA was passed. And so why do schools have to follow regulations? Why do they have to report the number of students that they're serving under the law and where those students are receiving services and who's providing those services? Is because they are getting these federal dollars. And so there does come some accountability with that. And so it's just one piece that's really important to understand, because as you begin to think about, okay, well, so who's determining and setting these rules? What one level the federal government is, and then states come in and then they add additional specificity to then what are typically fairly broad standards that the federal government sets up.
Question 2. What is special education? The law defines special education as specially designed instruction at no cost to the parents to meet the unique needs of a child with a disability. Specially designed instruction is further defined as the adapting as appropriate to the needs of the eligible child, the content, methodology, or delivery of instruction. Therefore, special education means that what a student is learning or how a teacher is presenting information may be adapted to meet the student's unique educational needs. Question 2. Question 2.
So in the second question, it simply is then, what is this relationship and what is special education? And so special education, the IDEA establishes that all students who are identified as needing special education services. So all students with disabilities who have this educational need are entitled to special education. And that is that instruction is designed specifically for the child. And then what that specially designed instruction is or looks like is specified by the IEP. And so when you're thinking about kids with reading disabilities, kids with dyslexia who have difficulty with reading, what are they getting needs to be specified within the IEP. So a couple of questions from now, we're going to really dive into the IEP and talk about that a little bit more specifically, but it's really important to understand that special education isn't just, it's what all the other first graders are getting or what all the second grade students who are struggling, that it really needs to be specified on a student's IEP, what is special education for that particular child. That doesn't necessarily mean that there's going to be, if they're 4 kids with an IEP in a class, there's going to be 4 different curricula going on, but there needs to be a specific attention to what a match between what an individual student's learning needs are and the types of services that student is receiving. And that needs to be written and needs to be specified on the IEP.
Question 3. I thought that kids with dyslexia could not receive special education services. Is this correct? The relationship between the IDEA and dyslexia is commonly misunderstood. For many years, administrators, teachers, and parents thought the students with dyslexia could not be served under the IDEA. In an attempt to end this confusion, in 2015, the U.S. Department of Education's Office of Special Education and Rehabilitative Services, or OSERS, issued a letter to state and local education agencies to clarify the relationship between the IDEA and dyslexia. In the letter, the Assistant Secretary of Education stated, "I write today to focus particularly on the unique educational needs of children with dyslexia, dyscalculia, and dysgraphia, which are conditions that could qualify a child as a child with a specific learning disability under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act." The purpose of this letter is to clarify that there is nothing in the IDEA that would prohibit the use of the terms dyslexia, dyscalculia, and dysgraphia in IDEA evaluation, eligibility determinations, or IEP documents. What did the OSERS letter mean? To qualify for special education services, students must meet 2 basic conditions. 1, they must be identified as having a disability that falls under one of the 13 categories of disability listed within the IDEA, and 2, have demonstrated an educational need that is not being met by general education. For a student with dyslexia, OSERS clarified that dyslexia falls under the federal category of specific learning disability, also referred to as SLD. For a student to receive special education services, though, a school's evaluation team would need to determine that the student has an educational need that is not being met by current educational programming.
Right, so there are 2 basic concepts that are covered in that last clip. And the first one is really important because it's commonly and widely misunderstood, which is that schools can't use the term dyslexia, that the term dyslexia cannot be used on IEP documents. And this was such a prevalent, widely acknowledged kind of idea that the federal government issued a letter to schools, to the public, saying, yes, indeed, there's nothing that prohibits the use of the term. Now, what you will find is some schools might be more comfortable using IDEA specific, the language of specific learning disability, which is the category, rather than dyslexia. But again, within those the IEP, and particularly within those goals, you want to make sure that the goals are specific to the unique reading, learning needs of that individual. So the first point that's really important is that there is nothing in the IDEA that prohibits the use of using the term dyslexia within documents. Second, within the federal definition of specific learning disability, the word dyslexia appears. So again, it is in the law, and it also is not prohibited for use on IEP documents. Other things get a little bit tricky and a little bit more murky and complicated, which Jennifer will dive into in more detail, is that can students with dyslexia receive special education services? And the answer to that is yes. But they have to meet those two requirements that any child with any disability has to meet, which is one, you have to have an identified disability, which check is going to be a specific learning disability, specifically dyslexia. But two, there also has to be an educational need that's being exhibited. So an example that I give sometimes in my classes is that you might have a student who might have a mild physical disability, but doesn't really need any additional services. That student might not receive special education services because they don't really have an educational need associated with that. Similarly, a kid may have received a clinical diagnosis from a psychiatrist of dyslexia, but be performing okay and doing fine in school and not really demonstrating an educational need. So that student wouldn't necessarily need special education services and then would not be eligible for special education services. So can students with dyslexia receive special education services? Absolutely, but they have to meet the same that same threshold that any student with a disability meets in order to receive those services. Yeah, I think that's it on that one. I was going to say, I'll dive in there and murky it up a little bit. So there are other services that a student with dyslexia might receive instead of special education services, and that would be services that were provided under a 504 plan. So a 504 plan is not separate from the IDEA. It's not part of that piece of legislation. It is Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, which is a separate law, which simply then allows students to receive some sorts of accommodations and supports. It's not, doesn't have the same levels of protection that a student would have under the IDEA, but sometimes you'll see that a student receives services in terms of a 504 plan.
Question 4. My school uses a multi-tiered system of support and RTI as a process for SLD identification. Is there a certain duration of time a student must be in a tier before an evaluation for special education can be completed? As highlighted by the OSERS letter, the road to eligibility for students with dyslexia is not always straightforward. Another possible point of confusion can stem from a school's use of response to intervention as part of a multi-tiered system of support for the identification of students with specific learning disabilities. Again, the U.S. Department of Education stepped in to clarify that the use of MTSS, such as RTI, may not be used to delay or deny a full and individual evaluation of a child suspected of having a disability. With this statement, the department clarified that a school's obligation to conduct a full evaluation to determine special education eligibility was not tied to RTI timelines.
So here is another situation where there's lots of questions arise. So when my son was growing up, we watched a lot of Thomas the Tank Engine. And so if any of you guys are familiar with Thomas videos, you will know that every now and then the controller yells at the trains when they have caused confusion and delay. So whenever I think about this question, I think about you have caused confusion and delay. So occasionally we can indeed cause confusion and delay in terms of making sure that identifying students, which is an obligation under the IDEA, is child find, and that is to identify students who are indeed students with disabilities and are eligible for special education services. So if a school or schools do, when schools are employing their MTSS process, or a student is formally going through an RTI process for to determine eligibility, then you want, it can't be that, oh, this kid needs to be here for 6 more months. We'll evaluate this child at the end of the year. So MTSS cannot be used to delay a full evaluation, particularly so if a parent is requesting an evaluation, the school can't come back and say, oh, no, we have to give this at least 6 months or some arbitrary timeline of how much time a student needs to be in a certain tier before an evaluation can happen. Within the schools, so for those of you who are parents and might not be as familiar with some of this terminology, most schools will have multi-tiered systems of support, which means that the second a student begins to kind of struggle, additional supports will be layered on, and students will kind of move through these different layers of supports. So there are many tremendous benefits for this. So at the first sign of trouble, we don't want to say, oh my gosh, I think this kid has a disability. We want to make sure that, oh, maybe are we not giving them good instruction? Are we not giving them, the type of instruction they need? So let's kind of play around with our instruction, see if we can get this kid back on track. So there are lots of benefits of a multi-tiered systems of supports, which is the provision of early intervention, so the delivery of some strong supports. Also, there's a school-wide focus and an school-wide integrated focus in terms of getting appropriate instruction delivered to all kids. But again, there can be these challenges that come about. So you're a parent and maybe it's now late first grade and you've been seeing these issues since kindergarten, first grade, and you've been saying, I think something's different. I think something's up. And you're beginning to think that the school's not really being as responsive and you really are interested or feel like a formal evaluation needs to occur. MTSS timelines cannot be used to delay that evaluation. And I'm looking over at questions sometimes, and Jennifer, you can always feel free to hop in on any of this stuff, although I know you're going to get to it in a minute as well.
Question 5. Once a student with dyslexia qualifies for special education, what protections are they provided? Students who qualify for special education are afforded 3 main legal protections. 1, a free, appropriate public education, the delivery of services in the least restrictive environment, and due process under the law. To ensure that a student with a disability receives a free, appropriate public education, also known as FAPE, an individualized education program or an IEP is developed for the student. The least restrictive environment means that, to the maximum extent appropriate, a student with a disability should be educated with students without disabilities and not removed from general education settings, unless that student's needs cannot be met in that setting with supplemental aids and services. A parent or local educational agency may request a due process hearing with respect to any matter related to the identification, evaluation, or educational placement of the child or the provision of FAPE by filing a due process complaint. During a due process hearing, each party can present their views in a formal legal setting, using witnesses, testimony, documents, and legal arguments that each believes is important for the hearing officer to consider deciding the issues in the hearing.
Okay, so before, when I alluded to, there are different protections provided under the IDEA, then you would get under a 504 plan. And so here, this clip is really addressing what those protections are. And those protections are that the student is guaranteed, or the guarantee is a free, appropriate public education, which means that there's going to be no additional cost incurred to the parents as a result of getting some specialized instruction. And the instruction should be appropriate, meaning it should map the needs of the students on the IEP. We're going to start with the student's present levels of performance. And so we know what that student can do. And we also know what those students' needs are. And so we're going to map that instruction to those needs to make sure that we are designing an instructional program that is meaningful and anticipated that gains can be made from the delivery of that instruction. The IEP also under special education, students are also guaranteed the delivery of services in the least restrictive environment, which means to the greatest extent possible, students receive their instruction with peers without disabilities although the least restrictive environment for one child that will look different from another child, which is why there is a continuum of services, continuum of placement and service options provided under the IDEA, which means that a student with a significant reading disability, making kind of a modification of the current reading program that's happening in their class might not be sufficient for that student, might not be an appropriate instructional environment for that student, and therefore getting pull-out services or services, reading instruction delivered by a specialist in a different setting might be more appropriate, which would then be the least restrictive environment for that individual child. And then finally, there is due process under the law, which means that parents have the right to request. So if they request a hearing or request information, if they've got questions about what's happening in the IEP, they disagree with what's happening in terms of the IEP or the provision of special education services, they have a right for an impartial hearing to determine what is the right avenue or what is the legal avenue in terms of what that student needs.
Question 6. What is the relationship between an IEP and the services a student with dyslexia will receive? A team composed of parents, a school administrator, one or more general educators, a special educator, and any person such as a school psychologist who administered an evaluation of the student, as well as any related services personnel such as a speech-language pathologist or physical therapist, develops the IEP. The IEP has two primary purposes. First, the IEP must specify measurable annual goals. For example, for a student with dyslexia, an IEP goal may be, by the end of the 12-month period, when given a list of 50 words that reflect first-grade phonics skills, the student will be able to read 45 out of 50 words correctly. The second purpose of an IEP is to identify what, when, and where the special education services, as well as any related services, will be provided to the student and by whom. IEP goals drive the specification of services. What does the student need to learn? Where, when, and how can supports be provided to help the student meet these goals? Strong, clear goals are the backbone of FAPE.
So this is one where I really feel like as teachers and as parents, the power lies within the IEP and writing a really strong IEP. The power of an IEP on both kind of the district side and the parent side is that this is our tool for communication. And it reminds me of when students defend their dissertation. So when graduate students are going through this process of getting their doctorate, and they come up with an idea they propose what their dissertation is going to be, and we have a pre-meeting before they begin their research. And I always say kind of the messier that meeting is, the better, because you want to get it all on the table so everyone knows exactly where you're going with your research study, so that by the time you're presenting your data, people are like, that is super interesting. And I feel like an IEP process, development of an IEP is the same way, is that this is where we kind of figure out, and a teacher might be saying this, or school personnel might be saying this, and a parent might be wanting this. And so there can be a lot of miscommunication, or we can, the parent think, like, I think they know that. And the school's like, I'm assuming they know this. But really, if we don't get in there and have these conversations and make it very explicit, and so the parent might say, I'm expecting or wanting this. And the school might say, oh, well, we will be providing this, which is going to give this or that. It's really when we kind of get into this nuts and bolts then that a really strong IEP can happen. And also both parties know what the expectation is and what's going to happen. And again, a strong IEP creates strong special education and really helps both parties as they move through this process. So again, whether you are a teacher who's thinking about preparing an IEP and you're thinking about what does the student need to learn, where, when, and how are the services going to be provided, or you are a parent saying, this is what I want my child to be learning, or this is what I'm expecting my child to be learning. This is where I think, or you tell me where, when, and how that might happen. And it's through those conversations that then there's a lot more clarity and a lot more understanding about the type of services that the child will be receiving.
Question 7. Can a specific reading program be written into an IEP? Some families may have heard about a specific reading program and they would like the school to use that program with their child. The legal term for a specific reading program, like Wilson Reading or Linda Moot Bell, is a methodology. When a family requests that a specific program be put on an IEP, they are requesting to add a methodology to that IEP. Most schools do not specify a specific methodology with IEPs. There are many reasons why a school may resist incorporating a specific methodology within the IEP. First, the school may not have teachers trained in that specific program or approach or have those unique curricular materials. Second, the school may be providing a comparable approach to reading. In other words, the school may not offer the specific program requested, but they offer similar instruction. Finally, a school may provide a different methodology, but that methodology is reasonably designed to support student progress on IEP goals. Thus, the legal answer to the question, can a specific reading program be written into an IEP, is twofold. 1, there is nothing in the law that prohibits the inclusion of a specific methodology. But 2, historically, parents who exercise their due process rights to have a specific reading methodology included in an IEP have been unsuccessful. A handful of recent cases, though, have tied the use of specific methodology to the delivery of FAPE.
So this is a tricky one, and one that question that I get very, very frequently from parents is kind of, I want X reading program for my child. And sometimes as parents, you've heard about this, you've read about this, you know about this program, or you know somebody whose child received this program or a different school that's using this, and you're thinking, this is really and truly what I want. And I know that this is a strong program for whatever reason. You can get some resistance from that. And there are some, what I would consider really valid and strong reasons why a school might resist naming a very specific program within an IEP. And then there are some less valid and more suspect reasons why a school might resist it. So again, if we're giving kind of the benefit of the doubt on some of this, you might say, okay, I am wanting this program, but the school says, we don't offer this program, but we will do this program. It is good to ask some questions about, what is the program, what are specific features of that program? And so I think that as whether you are a teacher and you are advocating for your school to be using a particular reading intervention program or reading curricula, or you are a parent and you're wanting a certain approach to be used, it's really important to think more of program features than, oh, I have to get them to use X program or Y program, and really say, okay, well, is the program that you are offering, or is the instruction that you're offering, include these kinds of features? Again, some of the big idea features that you want to be asking about and looking for are, first and foremost, direct teaching of letter sounds and how blends sound together for reading. So I think what we've seen very historically in the schools, particularly in this day and age of lots of balanced literacy, is that schools are doing a sprinkling of phonics. So maybe we have these separate phonics lessons, but when it comes to reading and connected text, it's a lot of guided reading. So we're reading along, kid makes a mistake, and we might be asking them to use a variety of different strategies, such as looking at the picture or first letter to kind of guess what a word is, rather than, today we're going to be talking about the SH digraph, and we're going to be shushing our way out through class, and then we're going to be reading connected text that has the SH digraph. I don't know why I picked that one. Digraph within instruction. And we're going to be blending those together. We're going to be blending that digraph with other sounds to read novel words. And so that's the kind of instruction that you're looking for. So you want us to ask them about, so school might say, oh yeah, we do phonics. And you're like, tell me a little bit about that. And so is there scope and sequence for how that's being taught? And are you actually teaching them the blending skills and giving them lots of practice in reading both words in isolation and in connected text to really reinforce those skills? So that's first and foremost. Second, talk to me about, how is reading and spelling integrated? And so what we know is that reading and spelling are two sides of the same coin. And so reading is, we're going to map, we're going to go from the, print to speech, and spelling, we're going to go from spelling to, from speech to print in terms of writing those letters. And so are those integrated? So not only are we talking about SH digraphs and blending those for readings, we're also spelling and writing words that include that SH digraph. And maybe on our spelling test, we're seeing words that feature that pattern, or certainly on that spelling test, we're seeing words that feature that pattern. So we want direct teaching of letter sounds and how to blend them, integrated spelling and reading, attention to handwriting and those motor movements. So we've got letter formation, which is then going to reinforce those letters and letter patterns, and then lots and lots of practice opportunities. So what kind of text do you use, and do you have students engaged in? Again, if we're seeing lots of leveled text that have, lots and lots of different phonic patterns in it, but not very systematic, and we're not going to get lots of practice in what it is the students are learning, that's going to be problematic. Lots of predictable text where students are really just guessing the words, that's not going to be helpful. So you really want to make sure that there's opportunities reading connected text where students are getting practice applying their new skills. All right, so, and I already talked about some of these warning signs, which is that if a program is talking about particularly an intervention at the intervention level for kids with dyslexia, we're using any kind of guided reading or leveled literacy with those level text or the units of study methods, then those are really not going to be appropriate for getting at the needs that a student with dyslexia has in terms of their reading instructional needs. The other thing that you might see is, again, you might say, oh, well, we do phonics, but is that incidental phonics? So are we just doing some activities where maybe we are, talking about the letter H, and then we're just painting and coloring ships for the rest of the day, but we're really not engaged in literacy activities where students are writing words, reading words, and practicing blending sounds together to read words.
Question 8. What about accommodations for students with dyslexia? Many students with dyslexia benefit from the use of accommodation. Accommodations allow students to bypass barriers in order to access information or demonstrate knowledge. For example, students who struggle with spelling and syntax may benefit from the use of writing assistant software such as Grammarly. Similarly, a student who is unable to read grade-level text can benefit from listening to audio versions of those books. Accommodations, however, should not be used as a substitute for targeted, individualized instruction. In other words, academic and functional advancement for students with dyslexia requires structured instruction in the key components of skilled reading. Now let's review. What is the federal special education law? The Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or the IDEA. Can the term dyslexia be included on an IEP? Yes. There is nothing in the IDEA that would prohibit the use of the terms dyslexia, dyscalculia, and dysgraphia being used on IEP documents. What is the purpose of an IEP? An IEP is the legally binding document that reflects the free, appropriate public education that a student is to receive. Do IEP goals matter? Yes. IEPs drive the delivery of instruction provided to a student. Strong IEP goals help ensure the delivery of FAPE. Is an accommodation the same thing as instruction? No. Accommodations allow students to bypass barriers. Instruction builds students' academic and functional skills. Many students with dyslexia benefit from the use of accommodations, but accommodations should not be used as a substitute for targeted instruction in students' areas of need. Funding for the Dyslexia series was provided by the Georgia General Assembly.
All right, so I'm going to end before I hand the baton over to Dr. Lindstrom on something that is very near and dear to my heart, which is this notion of accommodations for individuals with dyslexia. And a lot of teachers think, oh, I have a student now who has dyslexia. What are the accommodations I need to provide? And accommodations can be very, very important for the independence of a person with dyslexia because they allow them to bypass barriers. So I need to read this book, but I'm a very slow reader and I don't have all the skills to do it. I can listen to an audiobook and get access to that same content so I can engage in class discussion about that book. That is a fantastic tool, but accommodations too frequently are used in replacement instead of, as a replacement instead of instruction. And that's where I get very, very nervous when people, talk first about accommodations and second about instruction. That really should be flipped. And what the focus and what you want to look at when you're developing an IEP is that those goals reflect not just, hey, here are the accommodations we're going to do, but that here's the type of instruction the student's going to receive. Here are the type of skills that we want the student to acquire. Right now, the student has these skills. We want these skills by the end of this annual period. So direct teaching of reading should be the primary focus of the IEP, and certainly accommodations can be listed and specified. Again, it should not just be, oh, here's a list of accommodations. If you've got an IEP that has check boxes and you just check all the boxes, that's not appropriate either. We really want to make sure that they're mapped and they make sense. For some students, having extended time, it isn't necessarily the most effective or efficient thing to do. But if we do provide extended time for them, we should teach them how to make use of that extended time. Another very common accommodation that you see for kids with dyslexia is keyboarding, which is fantastic. And what I never see is keyboarding instruction. So if we are going to give student an accommodation, we need to make sure that we are providing time and even writing in an IEP goal that says this student will learn how to use and will learn how to master their speech to text. They will receive, however many minutes, 30 minutes twice a week on keyboarding in order to facilitate them learning that skill so that it actually can be a meaningful and useful accommodation for them. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Jennifer.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Sayeski. That was fabulous as always. And I did see, I shared some resources with Nicole to share with participants that were relevant to some of the points that Dr. Sayeski made. And I want to begin my piece here. Some of it will sound very similar to what Dr. Sayeski said. I'm going to give a little bit more either explanation or detail or kind of some support for what is happening or what some guidance that we would provide at the state level. But I also want to have everybody keep in mind as parents, as administrators, teachers, whomever, whatever hat you wear and you're listening to this, that the focus tonight was on IDEA. And for those students who are eligible, who are deemed eligible for special education services. However, when the dyslexia law was passed, one of the early questions we got a lot, we aren't quite as much anymore, I think just because we're trying to provide as much information sharing and professional development as we can, but continue to share this message is that, where a district may ask, representatives of districts may ask, so where does this kind of dyslexia fall in what division or what department, what office should we assign it to in our district? Is it special ed? Is it teaching and learning or curriculum and instruction? Is it MTSS? And my answer and colleagues' answer is always yes, all of that. So all those different tiers or areas or divisions, however you want to describe those, because it really is a tiered approach that we have to keep in mind, with the end potentially being determination of eligibility for special education. But we can't ignore what has happened or bypass what's happening prior to that, either referral or consideration. So I just wanted to mention that. Okay, I'm ready for the next slide. I think you skipped one. Yes, so just to reiterate, I know we've said it, but I just want to be sure that everybody leaves with this message very clear. Yes, we can use the term dyslexia. However, we want to caution schools, school representatives, teachers, administrators, SLPs, school psychologists, not to tell a family that a student has dyslexia. So we have provided templates for once we get into the screening process of identifying characteristics of dyslexia, the point at which a parent needs to provide consent or is notified what the results are from that screening process of what that language should look and sound like. And it's not that your child is diagnosed with dyslexia or has dyslexia. Again, we're focusing on characteristics of dyslexia that may or may not allow the student to be considered for special education eligibility under the umbrella or the category of SLD. So again, we're focusing on characteristics based on SB 48. Okay. So Dr. Sayeski already talked about this, but I'm going to talk a little bit more, provide a little more explanation. So is SLD identified through a special education evaluation the same as a diagnosis of dyslexia? So again, just to clear up some of the confusion, Thomas the Train yelling out confusion. Although dyslexia is often referred to as a medical diagnosis, the diagnosis of dyslexia is given by a licensed psychologist. So that's somebody independent outside of the school system that could provide a diagnosis of dyslexia. A primary care doctor, a pediatrician, that person does not diagnose dyslexia, or they shouldn't be. They receive very little training, if any at all, in their medical training and on this, so they should be referring to licensed psychologists for a follow-up evaluation or a complete comprehensive evaluation. So the SLD diagnosis of dyslexia is made based on the current diagnostic guidelines in the DSM-5, and it may be called an SLD with impairment in reading. So I've reviewed many comprehensive evaluations and those reports. And oftentimes that is what, especially now with this focus on dyslexia and parents saying, well, my school is rejecting this diagnosis, so, of dyslexia. So, I've seen a shift a little bit in just using the term SLD and impairment in reading, which is perfectly appropriate. That is essentially dyslexia. Okay. So the label, sorry, I'm getting all sorts of pop-ups here. The label SLD is used both in schools and clinically. However, they don't mean the same thing. So the diagnostic term SLD, specific learning disorder, and the special education category is specific learning disability. So one is more a clinical disorder, and the category is SLD, specific learning disability. Again, schools do not provide a diagnosis of dyslexia, and we've already mentioned this. It's provided by a licensed psychologist, but as we also are aware, I think many of you on this webinar, beginning in 2024-25, all elementary schools will be required to screen and identify students in grades K-3 with characteristics of dyslexia according to Senate Bill 48. So currently, there are 3 ways a student with characteristics of dyslexia may come to the attention of schools and families under the dyslexia identification, again, characteristics of in Georgia. So a parent may opt to pursue a private evaluation and receive a diagnosis from a clinical psychologist or licensed psychologist with a diagnosis of dyslexia. Again, that parent, if they bring that evaluation with a diagnosis of dyslexia to a school, that does not automatically guarantee them special education services. The school may identify characteristics, this is a second way, of dyslexia through its screening system and MTSS process. And then the school will report the information to parents and use the knowledge of dyslexia characteristics to guide instruction. Again, we want to caution, or I'd like to caution all of us to not be so distracted, or not distracted, but pay too much attention to the label, but really on where are the deficits, what are the weaknesses, and how can we support that student at any level, at tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 special education. And one side very related note, and I'll talk more about this in a moment, but through our pilot program, there are 7 school districts who are participating prior to the implementation of the bill in 2024-25 statewide. What we've learned, they've completed year 2 and we're now in year 3. But a lot of the findings, they've highlighted the critical importance of the MTSS process and implementing it with fidelity and moving these students, through the tiers accordingly, and not just all tier 2 students then receive the same type of intervention. It really has to be very specific to the deficit areas that were identified through the multiple screeners or assessments that have been administered, including progress monitoring tools. So there's a little bit more on that, number 2. And then third, a child, as we've talked about a lot this evening already, may be identified through a special education evaluation and require special ed services under SLD category. And I did see a question about, well, what does a dyslexia evaluation look like? And it's really, there's really a multi-pronged answer to that, because it depends where you are in the process. If we're wanting to identify early indicators, that would be more through the screening and progress monitoring MTSS. And that would be identifying these characteristics that, well, we're not quite sure we would diagnose. It's not necessarily at the severity we know right now to determine eligibility for SLD. However, that can be starting, that can start. So that would look like more of a screener, kind of a broader assessment being given, well, not broader, but looking at very specific skill areas. But the most important component with that is we want to intervene accordingly. But when you get to the point in the process where a child might be referred for special education determination, those tools look different than the screening tool. So you wouldn't just say, well, we already have the data we need from the screeners, so we don't have to administer any additional instruments or assessments. At that point, you want ones that are very specific to eligibility, learning disability determination. And so your school psychologist would be directly involved in that process. But up to that point, the school psychologist really isn't involved in the screening process. That's really at the teacher level. It could be EIP teachers, classroom teachers, because they're the ones who are looking at and interpreting the data, and most importantly, responding accordingly through intervention. Okay. So just last takeaway that I want to make sure that we highlight. It's important to note, again, a child may not qualify for special education, but still have characteristics of dyslexia, which means we still need to provide very explicit targeted instruction for an intervention for these students through the MTSS process. So getting back to, again, as Kristen said, or Dr. Sayeski said, that accommodations are near and dear to her, as they are myself, in that I've spent quite a bit of my career looking and in examining, researching the accommodation use among not just in K-12, but college students, and looking at it in different ways. But I want to restate her point that we don't want to bypass targeted intervention and to prevent or remediate reading deficits and just provide accommodations. So, we really want to caution parents who are requesting specific accommodations first, but we really just ask for targeted intervention. And then of course, consider accommodations. But one question that's come up multiple times and has been sent my way is throughout the screening process, MTSS process, if a student is identified with characteristics of dyslexia, are they eligible for accommodations? And no, they'd be handled in the same way or addressed in the same way as throughout the whole MTSS process. So a student isn't formally eligible for accommodations until they either have a 504 plan or an IEP. It doesn't mean a teacher can't opt to do some sort of informal accommodations or just to see how effective they might be. And then another really big question, we could spend a very long time on this, and I hope to in the future. I've gotten the question a lot, how does SB 48, the dyslexia law, take into consideration English learners? So it doesn't specifically, the law itself does not specifically address screening or intervention for English learners. But I'd like to mention some really, I think, impactful and potentially I guess, meaningful work. I hope it's meaningful, that we just started this last week. We had formed a dyslexia task force that's approximately 60 members. And we met for a half day on last week. Within that group, we have divided into 7 different working groups. And one of the charges of a working group is English learners and dyslexia. And we don't have a section right now in our current handbook that addresses that. And that is an oversight now that we're learning more and we're ready to provide guidance to districts on that. That's something that's one of the deliverables of that working group, is to create a section for guidance for English learners. We also are there's a working group that's creating a statewide professional learning strategic plan over the next 3 to 5 years. We're also updating the MTSS section of the handbook, intervention section. We have a specific working group on guidance and process for identifying characteristics of dyslexia for schools to use that would include a rubric, a flow chart, etc. And then we also have a working group that is going to be creating a parent handbook for districts to use. And so we're hoping to kind of systematize all of this information and make it more standardized across the state. So districts are using the same, like these videos, the same information or the same resources, rather than trying to find their own that may be very useful and meaningful or may not be. Okay, I think that does it with 2 minutes to spare. Look at that.
That was fantastic. So if you don't mind, there is a couple of questions with a common thread running through them. So I thought in just this last couple of seconds, if we could address it, there needs to be maybe a little bit of clarification around the difference between a school psychologist and a licensed psychologist who would do formal evaluation. So can a school psychologist formally evaluate for dyslexia?
So in that context within the school, it would be a special education evaluation. So I've had a lot of parents ask questions, well, my child already has an IEP and they were identified with specific learning disability with impairment in reading, but I really want my child evaluated for dyslexia. And that's essentially the same thing. So you've gotten more than you would get from a dyslexia screener through that comprehensive evaluation. If your child has already been identified with deficits in reading and is eligible under SLD, that is what a school would say. And within that IEP, as Dr. Sayeski said, you can designate or you can indicate characteristics of dyslexia or has dyslexia, but it still falls under that umbrella of SLD in reading. So it wouldn't be that evaluation would not look any different when you get to the point of referral for special education.
Gotcha. And there was one other question that came in earlier, and it was, if a parent makes a formal request for an evaluation in writing, is a district obligated to do an evaluation?
They are, and MTSS continues while that child throughout the evaluation process. So nothing is put on hold. They're not services or supports or interventions aren't taken away until we decide, oh, is the child eligible? So they'll continue. And I did see this question I forgot to mention, and it is an important one. Where's this list of screeners? And I have the same question. Where is it? I don't know. I was told it's supposed to be on the agenda of tomorrow's board meeting. I haven't gotten confirmation on that. So I am on the edge of my seat as much as all of you are. So as soon as I have information, I will share it in any far and wide.
Okay, excellent. Well, that was amazing. So wow, a lot of information packed into an hour. So thank you so much, Dr. Sayeski and Dr. Lindstrom, for tonight's presentation and this discussion. We appreciate all that you've shared tonight. And I just want to remind everyone to definitely register for the 4th and final webinar in this series. It's coming up on January 4th from 7 to 8 p.m. And then be on the lookout for an email from the IDEA Georgia that will contain a link to tonight's recording, any materials, and there will also be a link in case anyone is interested in a certificate of attendance as well. And I just want to thank everyone again for their interest in dyslexia and to wish everyone a wonderful evening. Thank you.
I will see you guys next year.
Yes, 2023. Thank you.